The four basic pillars of transitional justice: truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Each one of them has a specific purpose, but they share some ends. First, to provide recognition to victims, and not just to their suffering, but to provide recognition to victims as rights bearers. Second, that all the transitional justice measures are meant to promote a certain type of civic trust, the trust in institutions and trust in each other. Third, all the measures are meant to strengthen the rule of law. And finally, that they are meant to promote social integration. The region that occupies us today, Israel and Palestine, would be perfect places to try the cross-border implementation of transitional justice measures.
We are talking about transitional justice, and transitional justice should deal with a transition from a conflict to a peace era, or from a dictatorship to a democracy. In our case, we are in a transitional period from a Nakba and the conflict to a more dangerous and escalating conflict, which is still going on, and nobody can know how it will end. We are witnessing war crimes in Gaza, killings, destruction, expulsion.
I therefore wish to note the immediate need to stop the violence as the first precondition to any discussion of transition. Now, once the violence is stopped, there are other important preconditions for transitional justice in Palestine, Israel. The first one that I wanted to mention is the imagination of coexistence. And in this space, TJ for Palestine, Israel necessitates imagining a shared future within the small geographic territory of Palestine, Israel. As the ideal became separation, it also gave space and place for dehumanization and an idealization of eradicating of the other. We don't want to see, we don't want to engage, we don't need to learn, we don't need to accept, we don't need to listen. And so the idea of separation, I think, in its core, the idea of a two-stage solution and its core as an idea of separation stands in the way of transition from violence and into more justice and peaceful alternatives. The second precondition that I wanted to mention relates to freedom and equality. Because TJ for Palestine, Israel should be designed with mutual recognition of Palestinian and Israelis' rights to life of freedom and dignity and equality in that territory or in that space. And equality in that sense cannot and will not coincide with any preferential treatment. And so the ideal or the idea or the dream of a Jewish and democratic state already frustrates by its own design. And the third point or precondition that I wanted to note here is the idea of positive-sum thinking, or the opposite of zero-sum narratives, which take priority in this conflict and tend to entrench processes of dehumanization, legitimation of violence, and a territorial annexation as a legitimate political goal. And so the idea of positive-sum thinking, I think, is especially lacking.
It's never early enough to do it, and that past experiences show the advantages of doing so. In Argentina and Chile, for example, were the original model of transitional justice. People started collecting evidence and building files about the cases as they were happening. The earlier you intervene, the more effective the interventions are. And finally, for justice purposes also, the more people feel accompanied and supported, the greater their willingness is to participate in justice procedures.
Here we are beyond the state and beyond the transition. So anticipatory transitional justice. And what we see is different actors turning to international institutions. So let me just give some examples. We saw a turn to the World Court. Could the court stop the war? No. On the other hand, the court found plausible rights for Palestine. They recognized the importance of humanitarian aid and for Israel to preserve evidence and also to make a report. We also have seen a turn to the International Criminal Court. With respect to Israel-Hamas, this definitely publicized and documented crimes against humanity. Beyond that, we're seeing in the universality jurisdiction cases, I can turn to the impact of the potential of these modalities. The first and foremost is humanization of the victims, humanized and publicized the situation in Gaza at the time. And the flip side is that when you bring in the response to October 7th, the importance of humanization of victims on all sides. And for reconciliation, this is extremely important that there be recognition of both sides. The other aspect, which is extremely important, is documentation. We're talking intra-war documentation, preserving the evidence during war. Thirdly, we're talking about the possibility of lustration, of the fact that when you have indictments, you delegitimize those who are involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so that can often, even if it's anticipatory, it can go some way to jumpstarting political transition. This is what I hope. And that means delegitimizing the Hamas that have been involved in October 7th and in related war crimes and crimes against humanity. And also on the Israeli side, delegitimizing the Netanyahu regime.
When we think about the situation today, accountability from the outside, or these bottom-up civil society processes of transitional justice in the more truth and reconciliation sense, as a way of creating new space for understanding, new space for different kind of dialogue, of coming to terms, of rehumanizing. That couldn't be more necessary, but it feels so divorced from the planet that we live on, which to me doesn't mean that at some stage we don't go back. So it's either zero sum or it's some kind of coming to terms with each other. And in that respect, maybe in the future, there is space for that. In the meantime, it's the externally imposed tools of justice.
We should stay focused on the issue of accountability, piercing Israeli impunity, and criminal justice.
I think so that it's impossible to discuss transitional justice without knowing the history of Gaza. Gaza was in the partition plan, was supposed to be in the Arab state. But following the 1948 war, Egypt assumed control of Gaza Strip, and it became a home of a population of Palestinians who were, as we call, refugee, expelled from the country, and came 1967 war, where Israel conquered a lot of space, territories. So between 1967 and 1993, Israel maintained a military presence and control of the Gaza Strip under occupation, as we know, following the takeover of Hamas. Israel imposed really very sealed land, air, and sea blockade, a siege, which means the term of occupation was changed. Hopelessness and desperation in Gaza, chronic humanitarian crisis, lack of future prospects, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prison.
We're trying to talk about transitional justice. I mean, is there a way to counter these motivations, to
Yes.
find other motivations to spiral out of this sense of victimhood, this disengagement, moral disengagement, etc.?
The situation in Israel, as some of you mentioned, is really, as I say, hopeless. But it's not really hopeless, because about 15% are ready for transitional justice. And this is thousands, 100,000 of Jews who are ready to start with transitional justice. And there are existing NGOs, so it's not barren land. It is something that you can work on this. I think that we can deal with the trauma that both nations really suffer very much till today, and demand by Israel and the world for state committee investigation, which is very important for the transitional justice.
In the case of Israel-Palestine, I think American Jews are playing a very specific role, a very important role in creating a context in which potentially Israeli Jews can start to come to terms with the fact that, with the legacy crimes, and with the fact that separation is not the paradigm through which we will get to peace and justice.
And insisting that I don't think that the transitional justice is a silver bullet, or that it can be applied in an identical fashion from one place to another. But I do want to say a couple of things. First, it is empirically demonstrable that peace agreements that include human rights components are much more sustainable than those that do not. Not that I am naively optimistic, but for example, my former colleague Caitlin Reiger, in her book on prosecuting heads of state, showed how between 1995 and 2009, 39 heads of state were prosecuted and charged and declared guilty of crimes. And so this is not a prediction, but I am absolutely sure that none of those heads of state ever imagined that they would end up being prosecuted and declared guilty. So I don't think that one should lose hope. And finally, I don't think that we should reduce the discussion to criminal accountability. I think that there's a lot that can be done for victims, and that doing things for victims and in the public sphere in general also increases the demand for accountability. Let's not forget that Europe as a whole had to go through a process of mutual reconciliation after the Second World War.
The turn to the international institutions and actors reflect that people do think that this is significant. It publicizes, it preserves the evidence, and it delegitimizes certain actors on both sides, okay? And I want to come back to that things often have to get so bad before there's change. You couldn't predict many of the transitions that have occurred, the big ones, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, what happened in Latin America. We don't have those predictions, but I want to say, having come back from the region and being very heartened by groups working together. So this is the civil society piece of it, right? The international accountability and publicity, but also groups like Omdim Ba'Yachad standing together, blocking settlers from attacking Palestinians, standing up to the IDF where they are being passive. And I really do think that a horrible tragedy like October 7th has unfortunately reflected that doing nothing is not an option. That's how these groups that are operating from mutual grief are giving each other mutual recognition. And so I'm hoping that this will be a turning point in the region.
Transitional justice could have been relevant in the Oslo process in the context of Israel accepting responsibility for wrongdoing. But the peace process was devised around land and territory, and the principle of separation, two peoples, two states. This question of accountability was completely dismissed as a basis for peace. So what that meant is that Israeli society never had to face legacy atrocities, namely the forced displacement of 2/3 of the Palestinian nation and the establishment of an exclusive apartheid regime, really from the river to the sea. So that was a lost opportunity.
Truth and reconciliation, transitional justice were absolutely kept outside of the room at Oslo, and justice was kept outside of the room at Oslo, not just transitional justice. Oslo reflected the asymmetry of power, and in never redressing that asymmetry of power was quite doomed to failure as an exercise in sustainable peacemaking. It was actually a fundamental underpinning of the Oslo design that there couldn't be truth and reconciliation elements there. There couldn't be transitional justice elements there. If one kind of wants to put it in slightly different language and be generous, then this was about addressing 67 and making sure we didn't go near 1948. Everything always had to be about getting the end of claims and the end of conflict. There's another end of which should have been central, but it was largely marginalized, which was end of occupation. But end of claims particularly was about putting to rest any possibility of justice. What about the status of the 20% of Israelis who are Palestinian? Some of them themselves internally displaced from the Nakba. In the Geneva Initiative, which, as you say, was an imperfect, but the closest thing to at least looking under the plaster of that wound, not ripping off the plaster, was that we used a word called refugeehood. So we didn't go down the path of restitution and reparations, really, but one that went down a much more direct path of compensation and an acknowledgement of refugeehood. So I guess drawing a line under this, my reflection is that once you open that up, and at this stage I think one does have to open it up, you are in a place that Israel was conspicuously never willing to go to, and I'm not sure that you can ever get something that approximates a just, dignified peace unless you go there, because it's part of Israel coming to terms with the Palestinians. I think there is a direct line between that and what we see today, this attempt to go from Nakba 1 to Nakba 2 without ever acknowledging that there was a Nakba, or that there was some issue of justice or acknowledgement that had to be resolved.
Civil society organizations play a vital role in promoting different goals of transitional justice, particularly in the region. They act as advocates for victims, document the human rights abuses, and can influence policy by mobilizing grassroots support. Some of civil society organizations actively collect information on human rights violations. And these documentation efforts are an essential part of the truth-telling process and will be a valuable asset for any future truth commission or judicial proceedings. They document collective memory and give victims a sense that their sufferings is being recognized and acknowledged globally, even if their redress is delayed.
We have witnessed various initiatives by new and existing NGOs aimed at reimagining this new future, this new social contract, or even some of them are even trying to draft a new constitution for Israel. And I have to say that they do have a very genuine try to include the Palestinians within Israel, but still many of these efforts remain anchored in a framework that defines the state, as Shiri already mentioned, the state as both Jewish and democratic, thereby preserving the existing power imbalances between the Jewish and the Palestinian citizens. More critically, they often ignore two central issues that are critical for any future that we think about, any joint future that we can talk about. The first one is the ongoing occupation and apartheid regime in the occupied territories. And the second one, of course, the atrocities currently unfolding in Gaza.
And so the question is, but how do we get there? How do we reverse thinking? How do we reverse processes of dehumanization? How do we reverse, zero-sum narratives? This is, the main challenge that we're all facing. An option or a pathway for change is through external sanctions that would change the calculations of the parties, that would change the status quo and would make the status quo impossible or an undesirable option anymore. And I think that's the simple answer, and I think it is valid and it's important. Now, the other more complicated answer relates to an internal one. So how do we shift views? How do we change processes of dehumanization that can allow that sort of internal healing or reconciliation processes? I was teaching negotiation at Stanford, and one of the exercises that I was playing with my students was exercises of attentive listening, where one student had to tell a story and the other student had to just listen and allow the other one to just tell their story without interjecting their own ideas or judgment or suggestions. And I think that practicing that while speaking to my Palestinian friends at Stanford, in a place where we were on equal grounds, really helped me make that personal change to be able to really listen. And I think at the beginning I felt that resistance, but at the beginning I expressed it and then I expressed it less, and then I was able to actually pass kind of the attentive listening exercise. And at some point, the conversation was completely different, and I felt that my narratives are not as rigid as they once were. So I think there is a way to do that, but it's probably long and complex, and the conditions for that long and complex process are probably not right now in the midst of the horrible genocide and the terrible violence.
The Palestine-Israel situation makes the adaptation of existing transitional justice mechanisms a bit more challenging. So the conflict involves multiple Palestinian groups. The Palestinian groups each situated within different geopolitical realities and who also possess distinct and different historical experiences and grievances. And these include, in my view, 4 basic groups. So the first one is the Palestinians in Gaza who are currently enduring an existential and potentially genocidal war, following, of course, years of repeated military assaults and siege. The second group is the Palestinians in the West Bank, who live under conditions widely described as apartheid and who limited access to basic human rights. And then we have the Palestinians in the diaspora, who mainly are positioned in Lebanon and Syria, but also elsewhere. And lastly, we have the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who face systematic discrimination and exclusion, particularly in land allocation, education, and political representation. Although all these groups are part of the Palestinian people, the traumatic rupture of the Nakba fragmented their belongingness in some sense. And each group has since developed different and distinct relationships with the Israeli society and with the Israeli state. There are some shared discussions and collective processes that are essential, but there are also a critical need for differentiated mechanisms that acknowledge the specific atrocities and historical turning point and the lived realities of each group. And so in this context, transitional justice must be inclusive and pluralistic and grounded very much on the recognition of the layered identities, losses, and demands for justice that span the Palestinian experience.
To conclude, I would say that achieving transitional justice in Palestine and Israel is a difficult but necessary task. It requires political courage and moral conviction from leaders on both sides to acknowledge painful truths and take responsibility action. It also requires the support and will of the international community to ensure that justice is not merely an optional but an essential component of any solution. It is also important to involve the victims themselves in shaping this process.
I would like to emphasize that transitional justice is not merely a theoretical framework, but it's truly a psychological and ethical necessity. And in order to begin to build a future together, I need to know, I have kind of a psychological need to know that my Jewish fellows, my Jewish colleagues recognize and acknowledge the atrocities that are happening now in Gaza and in the West Bank. Just as I have devoted time and care to understand the suffering caused by the events of the 7th of October, I expect the same commitment in return. True solidarity and shared democracy requires nothing else than such commitment.
My work has focused mostly on the post-conflict scenario, where we're able to look back both on art that has been produced during the conflict as well as after, in order to assess how they have formed identities, how they've crystallized political positions, and how they've managed to create a counter-narrative, an alternative narrative, and archive this narrative in oral traditions, written traditions, music, dance, theater, etc. Art contributes to a counter-narrative and at the same time can be weaponized and used as propaganda, can be used in a revolutionary manner, or has been in the past used to incite people to violence. In my experience, it's useful to remind ourselves that art has been a way to document and create a parallel archive that far outlives the immediateness of the situation, the conflict, the event, or the scenario that it's describing. That's what the power of art and artists really is, to create a visceral, emotional archive and document the pain and the rawness of the ongoingness of that conflict, even when it's actually over, even when we hopefully reach a peace, have people live with dignity and with humanity. With that in mind, I would like to move on into Maya's work, her brilliant play, How to Remain a Humanist After a Massacre in 17 Steps. I'd like to ask you about what circumstances led you to writing this particular play in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th event.
As a playwright, what I'm trying to do is to peel the political layers and reach the human core in every character. of the play, which means that I'm showing different perspectives, and I have to understand all my characters. All my plays were dealing with conflict, with political conflicts, with wars, with exile, with civil wars. But I always wrote it from some kind of an external point of view. And with the How to Remain a Humanist After a Massacre in 17 Steps, it's the first time that I wrote the least analytically I've ever written anything. It was really a very emotional response, or some kind of an attempt to recollect myself, my worldview, everything I believed in till this moment. And I always treat it more like a testimony than a play, in the sense that I understood so far writing plays. Because I experienced the war through my being a humanist and being a mother. How should I put it? What kind of life am I going to give my children if I'm going to give up my humanistic views? So I wrote the play 10 days after October 7th. It describes the shock of the 7th of October, but it ends every step out of the 17 with the attempt to keep the notion, the knowledge that might have been cracked.
Yeah.
That what you experience now as a mother, the mothers on the other side, there are mothers on the other side of the fence too. So this was like a mantra. I was really terrified knowing how Israel responded to suicide attacks.
I also want to know what personal impact this play has had on you as a playwright, as a humanist, as a person living through a really turbulent time. What kind of an impact do you think it has on other people?
I let my closest friends, which all used to be humanists as I was, as a worldview, and people just could not read it. It was incredible to see how people read the play like looking for a symmetry all the time, like, but you don't speak enough about our pain. That would be always the sentence. But it was so absurd, because 99% of the story is our pain. So for me, I always felt, am I giving enough space to the other side? But nobody could at that point. It took some time. It was gradual when people came to me and told me, now I'm more capable of reading it. The general public in Israel, I was really cursed. Online, really bad things were thrown against me just for writing this so trivial thing. I mean, what am I writing? Of course, there are mothers on the other side of the fence. It's not something I have to prove, or so I thought. But in interviews, I would be asked, why should we be humanists? Well, I was just, writing from the depth of my soul what I was experiencing, and that was totally cancelled by many people in Israel. And in the end, I thought that the most suitable place was the Jaffa Theater. And the Jaffa Theater is an Arab Jewish theater where I knew the audience. And you may say, and I would like to ask you that, what's the point? It's a question we always ask as artists. What is the point of making the art trying to tell something to people who already think alike? In this case, because the humanists really found their worldview collapsing, I thought and that's why people were thankful for the play. It helped them recollect their humanism, let's say, process their own pain.
I think these instances of art serve so deeply within the community and within the international sector to humanize the way in which we see the way in which these events kind of occurred. And there are so many instances where artists have changed the course of a peace process. We also have evidence and examples where paintings, murals, theater, plays have caused communities to come together, rebuild. That also gives people a way to see their conflicts outside of themselves, a way to analyze interpersonal dynamics, but also broader political dynamics outside of their own personal circles of their own personal minds and emotions. And I think those are all really important in eventually creating a peaceful solution to any conflict, including this one.
To be able to have empathy for the other side, because we all know so well those sentiments, which can be both. It can be rage, but we also understand. And I think the understanding of the other's position is just so very important. Is the focus on victims' justice and starting in a way that process. We can't say TJ is starting at that certain point of time if it's officially there. It starts before. It starts before when we talk to each other. It starts before when we collect evidence. It starts before, as Shiri has said, when you listen, when you acknowledge, and you acknowledge the victims. So I think that is important. We hope that this TJ seminar, webinar is a start of a conversation which we cannot afford not to have.